Привет, Владимир! Расскажи, пожалуйста,
Hello, Vladimir. Tell us, please, what happened during the last week and a day, because we are recording this one a bit later than usual. Yes, apologies, I did not return from the business trip up until Sunday. But what happened is that I think I have won our betting with you. And we don't have the final data, but there are some leaks already, and we expect that Bloomberg probably would not be lying. And the government has already published the main parameters of the budget for 2025. This is the main Putin's financial document, out of which we can deduce that military expenses are growing by over 2 trillion rubles, over 27%. This is what we've been arguing about with Michael. The bet was $100, and we're expecting to see more data this week. I'll fish more in that muddy river, and I'll find you more data. But military expenses, Russia is increasing to over the 13 trillion rubles, and it will be interesting to see their official numbers when it comes out finally, because everybody is operating in the range between 10.4, 10.7 trillions. But usually, in the additional notes to the budget for the next year, they actually disclose the full details of expenses for the current one. So let's hold our horses and wait the official numbers and not just the estimations from Bloomberg and some leaks from the government. But what I wanted to say here, since I was gone for 7 days, I was on some business trips, and I was following the commentary of different experts. I am rather upset with the commentary, because the main background of that is that Putin still has a lot of money for war, and he can afford to sharply increase the military expenses. In reality, sharp increase, in my view, would mean at least double, or at least add 5 to 6 trillion rubles to that segment of the budget. The fact that they're increasing only by 2.8 trillion rubles, it only tells me that it will not let them create any decisive advantage on the front. To start with, this is the growth of 27% of a budget for the beginning. If you discount it by the official inflation, 8 to 9%, then it's already not 27, it's 16. And it's almost nothing. It's really spreading a very thin layer across different articles of military budget for purchasing, for logistics, for munitions. One would need a lot more money in order to grow their efficacy. And you're also discussing that in your military streams, Michael. It all tells us that they do not have capability to sharply increase military expenses. They've been squeezing some additional funds out, and that was enough for me to win the bet with you, but not enough to create some cardinal advantage on the front. They would have, or should have rather, increased their military budget by 5 or 6 trillion rubles in order to demonstrate that they have more resources to overpower Ukraine. What we're seeing now is that they figured out how to squeeze just a little bit more, and they still have that drive to increase the military expenditures, but it's very low heat, very low flame, and they're trying to balance their dwindling opportunities with the fact that they do need more money. So frankly, Comrade Putin, it did not work out. It's not too convincing what you guys are trying to do. With these resources, he has zero chances of really winning this war. And I've mostly seen negative commentary in this regard in the West, that, look, Putin has a lot of money. In reality, the way I see it is the sign of his weakness. He cannot really drastically increase military expenses. They have no resources to do that. And, sorry, Vlad, the money that he promised, do they have the money that they promised? Do they actually have that to add to the furnace of war? We'll get to that, Michael, and that's another interesting point here. The fact is that we only heard some general parameters, and I would like to deep dive into the notes to the budget. It usually is about 400 to 500 pages, and dive in there and see where do they want to take those funds from. But they in fact, are giving a very unrealistic number to balance income and inflow and outflow into the budget. And they're planning to have a trillion ruble deficit, but as we're seeing, they already are at 2 trillion rubles deficit. And they had to increase it. Initially, they had a plan of a trillion, and now they're already close to 2. So right now, they're controlling their deficit by keeping their expenses at bay, and they're limiting at about 2 trillion rubles per month. You could see that in August. But I think by the end of the year, we'll see the usual picture. Deficit will still break free from all that attempts to control it. And as you know, that usually happens in the last few weeks of December. I'm sure that we'll be facing exactly the same situation this year. They stubbornly, in the mode of mice were crying and poking themselves, but continued to eat the cacti. They are always putting a deficit at a lower level and then ending up having a double of that deficit in the year or close to that. So it's a big question, where are they going to find that money? We'll need to dive deeper into the details, but as I understand, they budget the price for oil next year at about $70 per barrel, and they're also planning to increase the inflow from their taxation of companies and physical persons in Russia. However, as we see, the economy is on a slowdown, so that means that the taxpayer base will be dwindling. And how will their fundraising go if the economy would slow down to 1 or 2% of GDP growth? That's a big question. What I want to say here is that so far their pink picture about low deficit, high income for next year, it looks very unrealistic, just as we were supposing that this year they would have to come back to that and revise it. And Putin in July signed corrections to the budget where he had to increase the deficit by about a third. And soon by the end of the year, we'll probably see even more increase. Again, this is Potemkin village budget. Oh, here's my co-host, Lucifer is here. The main story is that they have zero capacity to increase their expenses for military. They really want to, and they found a little bit, but again, as I'm saying, it's enough for me to win our bet with you, Michael, but it's absolutely not enough to give Putin any serious advantage on the front. So this will likely be spread in a very thin layer across different articles of their budget, and they will not be able to change things drastically. Once again, we are expecting more details to surface, I hope, this week. For that video to get more eyeballs, do not forget to click like, subscribe, especially subscribe. That definitely helps YouTube to promote it to more eyeballs. And if you can support the channel financially, there is a link to Patreon or just buy membership. And you can also buy VPN. This is a special VPN designed by Michael and his technical team that allows people to circumvent all limitations and use virtual private network technology in order to avoid different blockings. And if you have an opportunity, a chance to purchase it, please do so. That will support our channel. Because the goal of mine is to sell that VPN instead of gathering donations. That will probably be better for the health of our channel. All right, go back to Vladimir Milov. Very interesting with inflation. Last week, CentroBank published its minutes, and you can find them. It's an interesting resume of discussion of a key refi rate. It's an interesting read. You can see that this document has its own value, and for the first time in all the recent history, they started openly quarreling about budget. And they're saying in the open that if we do not start to shrink the expenses, all the budget then may basically cancel their efforts to lower the inflation by increasing the rate. And we can see there is a definite clash happening between central bank and the government and Putin's administration. Central bank is already accusing government that high military expenditures are precluding them from effectively fighting the inflation. Inflation this week was just slightly lower than the previous week, 0.06, but overall it's a pretty high number in a perspective of the whole year. And if you compare it with previous periods and months, we can see that it's definitely higher than August. So inflationary background maintains, and the inflationary expectations still continue to be present there. Central Bank continues to publish reviews linking to the sociological research and the groups that are measuring inflationary expectations of Russian citizens. Inflationary expectations are dangerous in their own way. When people are expecting inflation to be higher, they behave in a different fashion than what central bank would expect them to do when they increase the rate. They would prefer people to save more money, to not spend, but people are waiting that inflation will be high. So they are taking more credit even on the highest rate, because to heck with it, further inflation will devalue all that anyway. And they spend and spend more, betting that it's easier and cheaper to buy things now than next year or next period when it will be more expensive. So that situation is called adaptive behavior of citizens, of consumers in relation to harsh fiscal politics. And that's simple. Yeah, they're expecting inflation to be high, so they're buying things now. I can quote a few elements from that resume by Central Bank from the document. You can find those quotes there. Just take a read. It's a good diagnosis of what's happening with Russian economy now. Inflationary pressure remained rather high. The process of lowering the inflation, which we could observe at the beginning of 24, has not restarted yet. Inflationary indicators in summer were at 6 to 8% in annual calculation, and that tells us about at least maintaining the same level of inflation. And inflation in the third quarter is growing to be higher than expectations of central bank as a result of overheating the economy and inflationary pressure. And at the time when we made a decision about raising the percent rate in July, the current situation is even harder than we expected it to be when they set the rate at 19. So the difficulty of situation, according to the opinion of the participants of this meeting, leads them to believe that the rate of the central bank needs to be increased even further. Remember the previous meeting when they were discussing that we'll wait and see if nothing comes down, we'll raise the rate. Now they're sending an open signal that on the meeting of the central bank on the 25th of October, they are going to increase it. This is not even a hint, this is a prognosis. Nabiulina, on the bank forum in Sochi, there was a forum of bank associations of Russia, and she said in the open that they are considering raising the rate in October. So, and what you see on the markets, a very stale situation there, you can see that people are not expecting to see what inflation will be like. They're already expecting that inflation will definitely continue growing. And they're expecting a new rate increase from the central bank. There's a lot of talk about the inflationary expectations, and demand, in this case, can grow at a higher tempo, at a higher rate, and that will make it more difficult to control that inflation. So people continue to take credit, continue to shop, and continue to buy things now while money is a little cheaper than they will be next quarter. Nobody's even paying attention to the central bank rate of 19 or 20%. And during this conversation, they're accusing the budget, the military sector, that government is dumping too much money, and central bank is asking if it is possible to diminish these expenses. It's the first time that I'm seeing that conversation coming from central bank, pointing fingers and indicating that all these military expenses are making things harder for them. And it's not going anywhere. The topic of the deficit of personnel is only getting sharper. And what's interesting, they started to talk now that right now this cannot be solved by increasing in pay rate, because they're running out of physical persons. companies also do not have much capacity to increase the salary. Just economically, they're at their limit. And there is a number of publications coming out in Russia that the pay rate competition is running out of steam because companies are at their limits. They cannot continue increasing it. And the last month, it slowed down very notably. Remember, we talked about the real price growth index from Romir, that fast-moving consumer goods index. So that index in August was 22%. And I compared that with the last numbers on the salary growth that Rosstat is giving. And you can see that the growth of salaries is lower. It's in the purple on this chart. So earlier it was exceeding the inflation of FMCG goods, and now it's lagging behind because the companies have no funds, first of all, to keep increasing the salaries, and second, it doesn't solve the problem. You cannot attract anybody because you have no people. However much salary you put on this position, there are no physical people available to work that job. And what was interesting also, there were a lot of publications about that cadre deficit. Forbes was printing about 1 million persons deficit in trade. So they're literally looking for people with dogs. And there's also anti-migrant campaign that Putin's government started. You could have predicted the outcome of that campaign, right? When you're running low on human resources, let's also start a campaign against migrants, right? To exacerbate all that, to make sure everybody who can leaves. And suddenly, Minister of Internal Affairs, Kolokoltsev, came out and said that there is no way to index the salaries for police because the country has no money. Well, that's interesting, right? How this fantastic country run by Putin that is happily surviving all the sanctions, they have no money to pay to police officers. And they're facing the deficit of 152,000 officers. In Moscow, for example, the deficit of police officers is at 75%. That's according to the head of the Internal Affairs Ministry in charge of these forces. And I want to say that you've probably seen that chart, how the salaries are slacking behind the real inflation. The lowest one, if you noticed, is the indexation in the budgetary sector. It's basically at 12 to 14% maximum. And that tells us that police is also part of that group. Everybody in the budget sector do not see it in their future that their income will at least catch up with real inflation. Sorry, I cannot have any sympathy to Putin's police, right? And I think we'll be expecting them to solve their problems in a different fashion, right? As we know, if the salary is low, you have a badge, you have a gun, go make your money. And that's what I'm thinking, is that those 20% or 25% of the officers that are still present in the service, they probably will be making money other ways in that situation when there's very low salary growth. Oh, absolutely, Michael. I remember how it was back 30 years ago in the 1990s when the budget didn't have money. On one hand, they stopped performing their functions, and we see that crime is growing exponentially. And on the other hand, they likely will join some of this organized crime, extortion, and different things. So what I was saying also is that huge budgetary sector where there are tens of millions of people working, it is finding itself in a pit where budget has no money to index their salaries in accordance at least with the official recorded inflation. I'm not even talking about that 22% of FMCG. You know, when suddenly you hear that somebody says the income of Russian citizens is sharply growing, what it means is that the top managers of some military companies, they probably have grown times over, but the budgetary segment and people on federal support and pensions, their income is definitely slacking way behind. So this consists of two parts, and that split between two parts of society will only grow. We'll need to look at the numbers of the budget for next year, but I think the capability to index the salaries to match the inflation is definitely not there. What else is interesting? Gasoline, 98, continues to grow. Now, many people are saying that Russia does not consume too much of it. Well, not so. They still consume about 1 million tons. Big cities, a lot of vehicles consume 98 gasoline, and it has grown by 60 kopecks, 60 cents over a week, and over 5 rubles since the beginning of August. And they're still using gasoline damper schemes to hold prices for gasoline 95. But since the beginning of this year, it grew by 7%, or 4 rubles in monetary value. Another story is that economic slowdown continues to occur. Russian Stat published the data on the industry for August. The temp growth slowed down compared to July. It went below 3%, it's at 2.7. And this is the number that was also back in June, and this is the lowest since the first quarter of 23. And what CentroBank is saying about that in their resume, in their minutes of meeting, they're saying that in the second quarter of 24, the growth of economy had slowed down. According to the data in July, August, the growth of economy was continuing to decline. And there were signs of cool down of consumer and investment activities, of further cooling down. And the index of business climate by Bank of Russia has been lowered for those months. So the slowdown of economy is happening. Every new data, every new stat being printed out tells us about it. Rosstat also published more data about military industrial complex, about military manufacturing in August. And here we see another interesting thing, that the production of ammo has really went down. It only increased by less than 9% in annual equivalent. If you remember, previous months they had at 40, 30, even 50%. And even electronics also went down. That's only at 12% compared to dozens of percent previous months. So the only thing that grew by over 30% in annual estimation is the production of military transport. And that's tanks, jets, armored vehicles. Here what we see is a very uneven graph. This is caused by long interval of deliverables. And some months they actually deliver product, the other months they're still producing it, still assembling. So the trend is still that military production is slowing down, notably slowing down. You can see it in numbers, and it reaches some sort of plateau. And I think the key problem here is the deficit of equipment and inability to expand the production lines. They reached their max capacity, working in 3 shifts. And further, CentroBank is noting that everything is already at capacity, everything is at 100%, and they have no ability to add more production lines. And there where the crux of the issue is that the production is slacking behind all the investments into that sector because they physically cannot produce more output. What else? Federal bonds, they broke through another barrier, another threshold of profitability. Now they're at 16.53% per annum, so almost 17 on the horizon. And I want to remind our viewers that at the beginning of this year, they were selling them at 11 to 12%. And Kommersant is publishing that on the short-term bonds, the profit is already at 19%. On the long term, they're expecting 17%, connected with the plans of CentroBank to increase their rate. And Ministry of Finance is slacking behind in their plans of implementing that tool, that fiscal tool of federal bonds. They have only fulfilled it at 45% for the last quarter, and annual is roughly at about 50%. So they were planning to borrow 4 trillion and borrowed roughly about 2. And they only have 3 months left to the end of this year. So all those people who are saying that Putin will always find where to borrow if he has a hole in the budget, here we see that he cannot. He is failing to do that because servicing every new borrowed ruble is costing them so much that they need to find more money to continue paying for their debt, and they do not have this money. and also index of RGBI, Russian government bond, the index of Russian federal debt. We're waiting for it to break the threshold of 100 point, and it's closing. It's lower than 102, but still not at 100. Perhaps on the coming week we'll finally see it breaking through lower. So what else do I want to say here? Remember, there was an increase in price last week because of the hurricane in the Mexican Gulf and some optimism about Federal Reserve System in the United States decreasing their rate. So the oil prices went down again. After that, they went down to close to $70 for Brent. That means close to 60 on Urals. And we don't see much uptick for the budget of next year. Russia is expecting to see 70, but I do not see where do they find that 70. That's going to be a big issue for them this coming year. We've discussed that publication in Financial Times that Saudi Arabia is preparing to increase its output because the prices went down, they're losing their income, and they're losing the part of their market because of their lowered capacity, of lowered production output. So it did not affect the prices in any fashion, and Saudi Arabia is now discussing the increase of output. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I suspect if they decide to go ahead with this, you can see what Russia would be expecting in this case. So oil prices prognosis is very pessimistic for Putin. And I think in their fantasy land of some control deficit, they will not be able to hold. And we'll see an interesting discussion about oil. We definitely, in the months to come this year, and we definitely can say that it will not grow higher. The question, I think, will be whether Brent will be 70 or 60. And speaking about Russian currency, about ruble, Ministry of Finance in the project of a budget, they prognosticating weakening of ruble in 25, not a drastic one, but still there is no fortification of ruble that Putin's government was speaking about a few months ago. But sooner or later, it will continue to decline. It will continue to weaken. More points about sanctions I wanted to say in today's stream. First, remember we commented when Americans, most of all, and then 14th package of sanctions from European Union, they added new projects to the sanction list, the liquefied natural gas projects by Novatek. And just after a few months, Novatek is closing the biggest projects on producing liquefied natural gas. Murmansk, Obsk, they're on pause. A third line of Arctic natural gas facility is also put on pause. They were hoping to change their situation by providing a big volume of liquefied natural gas to Asia. That would have been bringing them a lot more income, tens of billions of rubles, if Novatek would have completed the projects. But they have stopped all of these projects now because sanctions are actually working. And we are expecting that current export of liquefied natural gas, unfortunately, still continues to Europe. But the key moment here is that Minister of Finance of Belgium, in her statement, for the first time, I think it's the first time when one of the countries, the biggest importers of Russian gas, they have a terminal in Belgium. This is one of the main points of receiving of Russian gas. So she's saying that she supports Russian natural gas exports into the sanctions list. This is the first time when Belgium is coming out openly supporting that measure. A lot of people are asking about the new Euro Commission, when it will be formed. Roughly, it will be functioning by the 1st of December, when the head of European Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right, we're still waiting for it. Yeah, they're slacking. They're moving very slow. But the new package of European sanctions will probably include Russian natural gas. And this is about $10 billion of annual exports to Europe that should have been shut down a long time ago. Finally, they're talking about it. And another point we're discussing at every stream, and it's one of the main headaches, is that a lot of Western companies are circumventing sanctions through supplying their goods to third countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Armenia, etc. The countries of G7, and you can find it on the site of Ministry of Trade of United States, have published some explanations about the export controls and sanctions on Russia. So what they're doing, they are implementing universal controls for all exporters. They need to monitor the final destination of their goods. Where is the final consumer? And if you fail to do that, you will be punished if it goes to Russia. You cannot play the card that I've sold to Singapore and I have no idea where it ends up being. So they've published a very important document. I think this is an armor-piercing document that went under the radar of many media. They should be writing about it. It took them a long time to make this decision, but all the major countries of G7, and I think it will ultimately expand to the whole EU and many other countries that were implementing these sanctions. So now business have a clear explanation that it is their responsibility to trace your goods to the end consumer. You cannot play the card anymore that you are selling it to Singapore and you have no responsibility that it sold it later to Russia. It's a very important story. We'll see how it will be implemented, but it's very good that we see this demand now, that the companies selling goods need to be aware of the final destination. And this is on a very high and mighty level. Ministers of Finance of G7, that was their decision. What else do I want to say? Real estate, they continue push and pull activity between developers and banks. And we can see that demand is dwindling. The stats coming out, they're saying that in September, in different regions, the dynamics go different ways. You can see that in Moscow, in St. Petersburg and Moscow district, there is a decline from 0.5% to 2.6%. This is new construction. But in some regions like Samara or Bashkiria districts, they have some anomalous growth by 8 or 10%. I cannot say why is it happening. Maybe some regional factors, maybe regional programs that support real estate purchasing, but you can see that overall in major districts there is a slow but decline in price. And Kommersant is publishing another article about secondary real estate market where the prices maintain. There's even a small growth by 0.2, 0.4%, but the salesmen, the selling organizations are continuing to offer discounts. So they keep the official price, but when you make a purchase, you get a significant discount. So the pressure on the real estate market is huge. 76 million square meters is not sold in newly constructed apartments. And I heard a commentary that they'll be holding it forever in perpetuity and will not lower down the prices. They can't. They have taken credits from banks and they need to pay them back. When you have 60 or 70% of new construction not sold, you have to bring the price down. You still need some monetary influx to pay the bank back on your credits. Otherwise, it will convert into the bank crisis. And the host of Statcom will be talking more about the bank crisis if the real estate or actual construction companies will fail to pay the banks. And that's why I'm expecting this market to lose its equilibrium pretty soon. I hope in our next stream we'll have more data about the official budget and we'll have more data on August statistics. So we'll continue explaining to you, dear viewers, the real situation in Russia. Thank you so much, Vlad. Till we meet again. Goodbye.